To Isaiah chapter 40. Isaiah chapter 40. I've been thinking a lot recently about a Bible study that I had with a good friend of mine back in 2016. We had several conversations about God and about what it looks like to live a life that is pleasing to God. And finally, I got him to agree to sit down with me and to talk about the gospel more in depth. And we were not very far into this study when my friend stopped me. And he said, "Sam, I hear what you're saying, and I see what the Bible says, but this is not the way that I was raised. And this is not what I have been taught to believe." And so I said, "Okay, what have you been taught to believe?" And he said, "I don't know." He said, "I don't even know what I believe. I don't know what my people believe." He said, "Will you come meet my dad so he can tell you what I believe?" I want you to think about that for a moment, because there's a lot there to unpack. Here's a young man, he's 18 years old. He's a fairly moral person. He's got good technical, good practical skills. He's got a plan for his life about what he wants to do for a living. He's still, to this day, doing very well for himself in his professional career. But when someone asked him what he believes, not only does he not know how to answer, but he needs his father to tell someone else what he believes. What this example shows us is that it is possible that modern education, even a religious education, is capable of producing socially and functionally competent people, all while leaving them completely untethered and uprooted from any type of spiritual heritage or framework. And I knew this young man very well. This was not an issue of not knowing how to communicate his beliefs. This was not even an issue of not having made his faith his own, as we often think of it. This was a young man who did not know who he was and who did not know where he came from. And I want to tell you this evening that this man is not alone, that he is part of an epidemic. And this lack of self, this lack of identity is affecting so many young people, especially young men today, even within the Lord's church. I want all of you to know that what I'm going to preach tonight, I'm not preaching this because I think it's interesting. I want you to know, and especially those of us who have been Christians for a long time, those of us who have maybe been raised in the faith, what I want us to understand is that this sermon is because of sermons that I've had not just out there, but because of conversations I've had in here. And this is a real struggle for so many people. It is a struggle for many of us. And I want to share with you what has helped me and what God intends to help us all. I want to suggest to you this evening that this identity crisis is directly related to the way that we have been taught by the world to think about history, or rather, how the world discourages us even from thinking about history. We have a lot of ground to redeem in this area as the people of God, thinking about history in general, but especially in thinking about the Bible as history. I think a big part of the identity problem is that we don't think about history at all. But even when we do, if we are thinking about it the same way that the world around us thinks about it, then there's no chance that we're thinking about it correctly. These young people, they don't know who they are because even if they know history, they don't know how to relate to it. They don't know what it means. They have been educated in practical skills, but not in wisdom. They've been so focused on how to make a living that they haven't learned how to live. They think about the Bible like a rule book or like a manual for morality or for religion, and that's not what the Bible is. The Bible is history. And for the Christian, the Bible is the history of our spiritual ancestors and how God interacted with them. Knowing that history is knowing God, but it is also knowing who we are. And we cannot know either of those things without seeing the Bible as divine history. I want to start our study tonight with 2 quick points about why knowing our history is important, and then we will talk some more about how to prepare ourselves and our future generations to be well-grounded and connected to the spiritual legacy of God's people. Let's talk for a moment about how history gives perspective. One of the most obvious truths about life is that it does not last. And even the longest of earthly lives is a drop in the bucket of eternity. But not even going so far as to talk about eternity, our physical lives are only just a sliver of history. And there are many passages that speak to the brevity of life, but one of my favorites is here in Isaiah chapter 40, and beginning in verse 6, it says, "All flesh is grass, and all its loveliness is like the flower of a field. The grass withers, the flower fades, because the breath of the Lord blows upon it. Surely the people are grass. The grass withers, the flower fades, but the word of our God stands forever." The reason I like this passage so much is because it doesn't just speak to the shortness of life, but it puts our lives in perspective. And not just our lives as individuals, but as it says, the lives of the people. C.S. Lewis observed that, he said, "A single second of lived time contains more history than can be recorded." When we consider all the lives of all of the people that have ever lived, the combined histories of all the civilizations that have been left behind and buried underneath the earth, God has interacted with all of that. He created all of that and guided all of that. There is more history that has led up to our time than we can ever hope to know or to learn from. And yet, even just recognizing the vastness of the lives and the stories that have come before us, that starts to put our lives in perspective. We tend to think that we are a lot more important than we are sometimes. And we also tend to think that our problems are unique to us and that we have it more difficult than the people that came before us. Or maybe we think that our successes are greater and we've made more progress than all of the peoples who have come before us. And when we think like that, we can only be thinking in ignorance. The proper response to the realization of our smallness in the grand scheme of history is to be humble, and to be humble enough to be willing to learn from those who have come before us, to look to the wisdom gained by past generations, either good or bad examples, and to use those things to help us to grow. In Psalm 90, Moses wrote in Psalm 90 in verse 10, he said, "The days of our lives are 70 years, if by reason of strength they are 80 years, yet their boast is only labor and sorrow. For it is soon cut off and we fly away." In verse 12 he says, "So then, teach us to number our days that we may gain a heart of wisdom." We only have a limited time on earth, and so we can be humble enough to learn from the past, learn from history, or we can become someone else's bad example to learn from. In Job chapter 8, if you look in Job chapter 8, I'd mentioned that before we read this, I would mention that we need to be careful when we make points from the dialogue of Job's friends, because frankly they didn't know what they were talking about, at least in regards to Job's situation. And some of the things that they said were just overgeneralizations. Some of the things that they said were true in principle, but they were presumptuous in applying that to Job. And I think that this is one of those occasions. At least that's the kind of way this passage is, the way I understand it. Bildad here in Job chapter 8, he's laying out a true principle that we can learn from, but he is patronizing in applying it to Job. He says in verse 8, "Inquire, please, of the former age, and consider the things discovered by their fathers. For we were born yesterday and know nothing, because our days on earth are but a shadow." We live lives that are too short and don't have the time to rely on the wisdom of only our own experience and even only the experience of the people that are alive right now. In Isaiah chapter 8, God spoke to Isaiah about how the people were going to respond to the difficulties that they were about to encounter. In verse 12 and 13, he says, "Do not say a conspiracy concerning all that this people call a conspiracy, nor be afraid of their threats, nor be troubled. The Lord of hosts, him you shall hallow. Let him be your fear, let him be your dread." And so in other words, God is saying when these bad things happen, this people is going to panic. They're going to see the power of Assyria. They're going to forget the fear of the Lord that had gotten them through all of these fearful situations before, and they're going to lose their faith. And so rather than leaning into their faith, they were going to look at their modern culture, the things that the people around them were looking to for assurance. And so in verse 19, it says, "So when they say to you, 'Seek those who are mediums and wizards, who whisper and mutter,' should not a people seek their God? Should they seek the dead on behalf of the living?" So I guess turning to necromancers and fortune tellers is one way to look at history. But God's telling Isaiah that this is not my way, and this isn't going to lead to truth, and it's not going to ground anyone in reality. And so what does God say to do when his people are trying to understand what is happening in the world around them? In verse 20, it says, "To the law and to the testimony. If they do not speak according to this word, it is because there is no light in them." You see, it isn't just that we know God's word. It's that we are so rooted and grounded in God's word that when everyone else around us is panicking and shouting conspiracy this, conspiracy that, we are not tossed to and fro by their panicked and untethered doctrine. We go to the record, we go to the testimony of how God has dealt with his people throughout time. We see that we have been here before, that there is never a situation that we might encounter that God's people have not dealt with in the past. And we recognize the patterns, not just in the Bible, but how the patterns in the Bible are repeated throughout history and carry over even into our present day. And we know that God has not forsaken his people and that he is still in control. But unfortunately, the pattern of the American society that influences us has been one of historical amnesia. Henry Ford represented this view when he famously said, "I wouldn't give a nickel for all the history in the world. We want to live in the present." And I paraphrase this part, "The only history that's worth anything is the history that we make today." That's foolishness. We see what that kind of attitude leads to in the book of Judges. In chapter 2, after the death of Joshua, in his leadership, he put a huge emphasis on the history of God's interaction with his people. He put an emphasis on the history of the nations around them. Joshua's speeches, as you read them, were essentially just history lessons. He made a huge effort to fill the nation with memorials of all of the achievements that God had delivered on behalf of his people. But when we get to Judges chapter 2 and verse 10, when all that generation that served with Joshua had been gathered to their fathers, another generation arose after them that did not know the Lord, nor the work which he had done for Israel. And I would presume that the major failure in Israel here was that the faithful generation did not pass their history and their culture on to their children, even though God had provided them with so much history to teach, and Joshua had provided so many memorials to aid in that teaching. And because of this large-scale societal failure to appreciate the past, it wasn't just the obedient, faithful actions of their ancestors that the people forgot. But in Judges chapter 3, in the first cycle of the period of the Judges, it says in verse 7, "The children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord. They forgot the Lord their God, and they served the Baals and the Asherahs." You know, at this point in Israel's history, they were still fairly new to farming. They didn't really know agriculture that well. They've been wandering in the wilderness. They've been going around burning Canaanite cities and plundering them and eating their food. Farming is not necessarily something you just pick up and you know what you're doing. The Canaanites, they knew how to farm. They had depended on farming. So much so that one of the primary functions of Baal was that he was to help the year's crop. He helped with the growth of the agriculture. And so you can imagine being an Israelite and you're struggling to produce the food that you need to feed your family, and you look over to your neighbor who's a pagan, and you see that he's succeeding, and so you ask him how he does it. He says, "Just go into the local cult prostitute. Baal will take care of you." And that's what they do. Israel forgot the God that sent manna and quail and brought forth water from a rock in the desert, the God who had taken care of them for generations, and the God who promised to never desert them. Forgetting history is what leads to fear. Remembering history provides an anchor of faith. We need to be careful, though, that as we judge the people of the past, because another error that we might run into is what C.S. Lewis called chronological snobbery. We look back at the people of the past, and we kind of raise our noses at them and think that we've got this figured out because we're on their side, on this side of history. We might think that we know better than them and their mistakes. But one of the key purposes of studying history as a Christian is to look at their lives and their sins and recognize those same mistakes in our lives and guard against them. That was the problem that Jesus addressed in the Pharisees in Matthew chapter 23 and verse 29 beginning. He says, you build the tombs of the prophets and adorn the monuments of the righteous and say, if we had lived in the days of our fathers, we would not have been partakers with them in the blood of the prophets. Therefore, you are witnesses against yourselves that you are the sons of those who murdered the prophets. Because a few verses later, in verse 34, Jesus says, I send you prophets. I will send you wise men and scribes, and some of them you will kill and you will crucify, and some of them you will scourge in your synagogues and persecute from city to city. When we look back at history, and especially at inspired history, we don't want to do so looking to prove what we believe to be correct or in order to justify ourselves. We want to do so to better ourselves, to fix our misconceptions, to increase in our humility. We don't want to be like those that Warren talked about this morning in Isaiah 5, verse 21. Woe to those who are wise in their own eyes and prudent in their own sight. Because if we do that, we might look at God's people of the past and think that we're not going to be influenced the same way they were. Or maybe we can handle this temptation with which they were ensnared. And that's where the Proverbs 16:18 quote comes in, that pride goes before destruction and a haughty spirit before the fall. But there's another proverb to consider as well. In Proverbs 22 and verse 28, it says, do not remove an ancient landmark which your forefathers have set. G.K. Chesterton wrote in 1929 about social reformers during his day who were like someone who comes up to a fence that is blocking a road and saying, I don't know why this fence is here, so let's remove it. Well, maybe that fence was there for a reason. Maybe it's doing something important. Maybe something happened in the past and someone learned what terrible things might happen if you go down that road. And so Chesterton just suggested that maybe we figure out why that fence is there before we remove it. The humility with which we should approach history should allow us to see that boundaries exist because people that are wiser than us learned painful lessons before we were ever born. And that's the sort of reason why it's so important for us to be familiar with inspired history. And that should inform the way we think about history in general. And when we approach history with this humility, with this intent to learn from it and grow, what we will find is that history gives us meaning. Like we already pointed out from the Henry Ford quote, a lot of American culture is actually disconnected from history, at least consciously. And frankly, that's why our society has so many of its problems. Because we live in America, because history is so often paid lip service in our culture, that affects the way that we naturally tend to think about everything. And if we aren't careful, it will even affect the way that we think about the Bible. Modern history is usually reported in two incorrect ways. The worst way is that someone decides what they believe, and then they go back in history and try to find some support for that belief. And a lot of people do that with the Bible. I've known Christians who have done that with the Bible. And that's a temptation for a lot of people. And really, no matter what we're looking for, we will be able to find something that we can twist to make it fit what we want it to say. But that doesn't make it true. And then on the other hand, you have some people that will go all the way to the other side of the pendulum, and they will try to write objective history, and they will try to be unbiased. But history is more than just telling facts. And even if all we do is tell facts, we have to choose which facts to tell. And the way that we deliver those facts and the way that we do those things is going to reveal our worldview. We can't just remove our values from the way that we tell or interpret a story. And it's relatively recent in history that anyone has even really tried to do that. What all that attempted objectivity really does is just strip history of its meaning. It's just something cool that I found out. Or maybe what happens is you turn on the History Channel and all you see is the aliens building the pyramids. which is interesting. But history is not there just as a bunch of trivia. And Americans have a nasty habit of allowing history just to become a hobby. It's just something we enjoy. But history, especially inspired history, means something, and it gives meaning. And so we should ask questions like, why is this important? What does this teach me about what is happening in the world today? How does this affect me? How does this point to God? And how do I fit into this story? If you turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 10, when we approach inspired history, we are told that it is there for our learning. And not just for our learning of facts, but for our learning of important lessons and eternal principles. The Old Testament isn't there just for us to win Bible Jeopardy at family game night. It's there for us to understand who we are and how we are to live. And so in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 11, Paul has been writing about all of these Old Testament figures who have felt the judgment of God, that their bodies are scattered in the wilderness, that they have been slaughtered by the righteous, that they have been destroyed by serpents. And then he says, all these things happened to them as examples, and they were written down for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the ages have come. Therefore, let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. You remember that point about looking back on the past and thinking we've got it all figured out, that we're better than those people? Do you think God won't send the destroyer for us? You think you are above complaining when God sends you into a season of wandering in the wilderness? You think that you won't give in to the temptation of sexual immorality if you put yourself in a compromising situation? The point of this passage is that we should take heed lest we fall. We're not better than the people of the past. And if we don't learn from the people of the past, then we might be worse. These were the people of God. These aren't just a bunch of random people. In verse 2, these were the people that were baptized into Moses. In verse 4, they drank from the rock that was Christ. And when we study about them, we're studying about us. And we will see our mistakes in their lives. Romans 15 and verse 4 frames this slightly differently. It says, whatever things were written before were written for our learning, that we, through patience and comfort of the Scriptures, might have hope. So look at all that God has done throughout time to bring us to where we are, to bring us into salvation, to get us to the knowledge that we have. Look how He has invested in our relationship throughout history, how He has forgiven so many shortcomings, He has been so faithful through so much difficulty. See how desperately He wants for us to be saved. Learn that from history. We'll talk more about this in a moment. But when we access the accumulative wisdom of God's people in the past, we're joining ourselves to them. We are participating with them as the people of God. And Deuteronomy chapter 32 is part of the Song of Moses. And it has been talking about the history of what God has done in dividing up the nations, how He made provisions for Israel. It's about to talk about how Israel forgot God and how they began to sacrifice to demons and to idols. But in verse 7 it says, remember the days of old, consider the years of many generations. Ask your father and he will show you, ask your elders and they will tell you. How do we remember the days of old? We weren't there. And yes, we see the principle of learning from the aged among us, but I think the principle in this passage is that we go beyond just learning from the aged among us and learn even from the aged who are no longer among us, to ask our forefathers who were there in the days of old by going to the law and to the testimony as God told Isaiah. In 1 Corinthians 10 that we just read, when Paul wrote 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 1, he said, our fathers were under the cloud and passed through the sea. When he said our fathers, he wasn't just writing to Jews. He's writing to Christians. And as a part of the people of God, these are our fathers, and we can learn from them. In Jeremiah chapter 6, God says, Jeremiah chapter 6 and verse 16, God says, stand in the ways and see, ask for the old paths where the good way is, and walk in it, and you will find rest for your souls. But the people rejected the way of God, and so he said in chapter 18, In verse 15, he says, "My people have forgotten me. They have burned incense to worthless idols. They have caused themselves to stumble in their ways away from the ancient paths." And so what happens to the people? They're scattered among the nations. They are a people with no direction. Their identity is stripped away because they attempt to make their own way rather than following what God had established. And being disconnected from their history and disconnected from their God, they don't even know the very path beneath their own feet. In order to know where we are and where we are going, it is absolutely necessary that we have to know where we have been and how we got here. Knowing history is essential to fixing our direction. In 1 Corinthians chapter 3, and beginning in verse 10, Paul is talking about the building up, the edifying of the church. And he says, "According to the grace of God which was given to me as a wise master builder, I have laid the foundation, and another builds on it. But let each one take heed how he builds on it. For no other foundation can anyone lay than that which is laid, which is Jesus Christ." This foundation is where we get our identity, but consider all that went into laying that foundation. It's not only the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, but it is the culmination of everything that came before that. The fullness of the times, all history built up to the cross from even before time began. All the lives of all our spiritual ancestors went into providing the shadows and the right circumstances for the foundation of Christ to be laid. And I believe this was foreshadowed by, and that Paul is referencing passages like Ezra chapter 3, when in verse 10, the builders laid the foundation of the temple as they were restoring Israel after captivity, and that many of the priests and the Levites and the heads of the fathers' houses, old men who had seen Solomon's temple, they wept with a loud voice when the foundation of this temple was laid before their eyes. They weren't creating something new when they were building this temple. They were restoring something old. They were building on a pattern that God had already established. Or in Nehemiah chapter 2 in verses 17 and 18, Nehemiah gets to the city of Jerusalem. He sees the ruins. He takes a ride around the city to see, to assess the damage. And he comes back and he addresses the people and he says, "You see the distress that we are in. You see how Jerusalem lies waste and its gates have been burned with fire." He says, "Come, let us build the wall of Jerusalem, that we may no longer be a reproach." And the people said, "Let us rise up and build," and they set their hands to this good work. When they were restoring the wall, they were fortifying and they were protecting and they were rebuilding what had been handed down to them already. When we talk about being involved in the restoring of the New Testament church, we shouldn't only mean that we want to be organized the way that God wants to be organized. We shouldn't only mean that we want to restore the corporate acts of worship and be consistent with the New Testament pattern when we're in this building. Those things are absolutely important. But we, the people of God, are the temple that needs to be restored. It's not the things that we do. It's who we are that needs to be restored. And that affects every moment of our lives. We don't do this just by looking at something new, but by looking at something old, looking back to the old paths, to an ancient pattern designed by God, developed throughout history, in order to tie all of His people throughout time together and to Him. And that's what I find so convicting about Stephen's sermon in Acts chapter 7, for which he gets stoned. It's essentially just a history lesson. He talks about the call of Abraham. He talks about deliverance from Egypt after Jacob's sons had been preserved there from famine. He talks about the tabernacle in the wilderness. He talks about the temple of Solomon. And then he says in Acts chapter 7 and verse 48 that the Most High does not dwell in temples made with hands. Stephen is pointing to the fact that God's house is His people, that God's plan all along has been to dwell among His people in perfect communion. But these Jewish leaders that he's addressing in verse 52 and 53 had become the betrayers and the murderers of the just one. They had received the law by the hands of angels and had not kept it. Stephen's point is they could have been a part of this, and that we can be a part of this heritage of faith, this fulfillment of history, or we can reject it like they did. There's a phrase used throughout, especially the Old Testament, to describe those who had forsaken the covenant. And that phrase is that they should be cut off from among their people. If we understand what it means to be a part of the covenant community of God, if we understand the connectedness that we have, not just to members of our local church, not just to Christians who are alive today, but to every saint that has ever lived, then not only will we be grounded in our culture and in our identity and what it means to be a Christian, but we will understand that if we choose to walk away, we aren't just walking away from God. We aren't just walking away from a relationship with our local church. We're not just walking away from our relationship with family. We're walking away from a heritage throughout the past, and therefore our inheritance even in the future. We are forfeiting our rightful place in history and our intended place in creation, and we're losing our only true identity. And so it's so important that we learn to view history in such a way that we can connect and respond to it, that we participate and we learn the lessons about how to live and who we are and what we are meant to do in our time and with our lives. We must do this for ourselves, but the way this kind of history is preserved and fostered is only by passing it down from one generation to the next. We saw that this was the failure that led to the time period of the judges. There's a lesson that we can learn to not repeat there. But in Psalm 78, Asaph wrote, beginning in verse 2, Psalm 78, beginning in verse 2, he says, I will utter dark sayings of old, which we have heard and known, and our fathers have told us. We will not hide them from their children, telling to the generation to come the praises of the Lord and his strength and his wonderful works and that he has done. For he established a testimony in Jacob and appointed a law in Israel, which he commanded our fathers that they should make them known to their children, that the generation to come might know them, the children who would be born, and that they may arise and declare them to their children, that they may set their hope in God and not forget the works of God, but keep his commandments, and may not be like their fathers, a stubborn and rebellious generation, a generation that did not set its heart aright, and whose spirit was not faithful to God. We've looked at this passage in a sermon recently to see the foresight that went into keeping the next generation faithful, not only telling them of the works of God, but preparing them to tell their children. These first 8 verses cover the religious education of 5 generations of God's people. But what does it mean that God established a testimony in Jacob? It means that there is a history of God's faithful interaction with his people. How can we know that God is faithful? We look back at his track record. We see the way that he has always dealt with his creation. And as we study and communicate that history, it shows us the character of God and the trust that we can put in him. God's testimony with his people, it's not only found in the Bible, it's found throughout all of history as he has preserved his people. Inspired history teaches us how to recognize patterns of God's faithfulness. But his interaction with the world continues even today. His interaction with us continues even today. And we should recognize that. We should praise God for that. He is still our God, and we are still his people. Notice as well what this text says about the faithfulness of Israel's ancestors. Asaph does not sanitize this history for it to be given to the children. It's important for the children to know and see not only the faithful examples of the past, but God's mercy and patience and faithfulness despite Israel's infidelity. God has brought our ancestors through wicked times, through their own wickedness even. But he did that in order to bring us to where we are today, to give us an opportunity to be faithful. And so Asaph is telling this next generation, this is who you are. This is where you came from. What are you going to do with that? In 2 Timothy chapter 3, we see what Timothy did with it. Paul told him that evil men and impostors would grow worse and worse, deceiving and being deceived. And he said, but you must continue in the things which you have learned and been assured of, knowing from whom you have learned them, and that from childhood you have known the Holy Scriptures, which are able to make you wise for salvation through faith, which is in Jesus Christ. What were the Scriptures that made Timothy wise for salvation? The New Testament was still being written. Timothy was wise for salvation because he knew his history. He knew the faithfulness and the character of God. He knew how to respond to evil men and impostors because God's people had dealt with evil men and impostors before. Timothy knew who he was, and so he knew what to do. In Hebrews chapter 12, after all those examples of faith and adversity in the previous chapter, mostly people from the Old Testament, the author says in Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 1, "Therefore we also, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily ensnares us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us." That cloud of witnesses, our spiritual ancestors, our people, the people of God, cheering us on as we run our race. Following their pattern, we are not a people that give in under pressure. We are not a people who draw back to destruction. We are a people who believe to the saving of the soul. Chapter 10 and verse 39. These are our people. This is where we come from. This is who we are. And so, before we close, we have seen the importance of knowing history. We have seen the meaning and the understanding we gain from not only knowing it, but participating in it. We have recognized the necessity of passing that history along. I want us to see that the danger to future generations, the danger to us, is not only that we fail to know facts about the Bible. The danger is that we fail to see ourselves as a part of the story. That we will not connect and understand that we are a part of a legacy and a culture and a heritage that goes back to the beginning and points on into eternity. We need to find our place in this, and then we need to help the next generation see their place in it too. But we can't see ourselves as a part of history if we don't know the history. And so you may have noticed the little animations here in my PowerPoint. You can thank Scott Brownfield for that idea. These are some of the visuals that the teachers in the back are using with our kids. Honestly, I think these are good for all of us. It's very easy for us to look at the Bible as 66 independent books that are all disconnected from one another. But the Bible is history, and the Bible is history with a very specific purpose to show God's power and His love and His desire for the salvation of His creation. And this is all connected, and we are all connected to it. And so here are the 17 time periods of Bible history. And if you watch some of the kids sitting around you, they might be able to show you some of the hand motions that go along with these. I know Aria is planning on doing that. So keep an eye out for that. So we have before the flood. God created the heavens and the earth. He had perfect fellowship with creation, walking with Adam and Eve in the cool of the day. But the first sin damaged that fellowship, separated God from mankind. Cain murdered Abel and set up a cycle of violence that led to the whole world being so wicked and corrupt that God sent the flood. God created the heavens and the earth, or God was sorry that He had created the heavens and the earth because of how evil everyone had become. But Noah found grace from God because he did not allow the world around him to influence him away from faithfulness. So God told Noah to build an ark for the saving of his household, and through Noah's obedient faith, his family was spared, and his sons repopulated the earth. And God told them to fill the earth, but instead they rebelled against Him, resulting in the scattering of the people. Noah's descendants wanted to stay together, and so pridefully and against God's wishes, they built a city called Babel with a high tower up to the sky, and because of their rebellion, God divided their languages and scattered them across the earth. The people became divided into different nations, but God called one man and his descendants out of those nations to be a special people set apart with a role to play in the reconciling of mankind to God. These men were the patriarchs. Abraham was called by God to be a sojourner in a foreign land that God promised to his descendants. The promise was to be carried down through Isaac, through Jacob and his sons that became the 12 heads of the tribes of Israel. One of Jacob's sons was Joseph, who saved his people from famine by giving them a place in Egypt. But eventually the Egyptians became threatened by the number of Israelites in their land and enslaved them, which eventually led to the Exodus from Egypt. God heard the groaning of his people, how they suffered under Egyptian bondage. And so he called to Moses from a burning bush. He sent him to tell Pharaoh to let his people go. But Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and so God sent the 10 plagues to teach the Egyptians and to teach the Israelites about his authority and his power. And finally, Moses led the people across the Red Sea, which God split for them to walk on dry land, and closed back upon Pharaoh's army to save the Israelites from their slavery. And so Moses led the people through the wandering in the wilderness. Moses took the people to Mount Sinai, following God in a cloud and in a pillar of fire. At Sinai, he received the law of the covenant for the people to follow in order to maintain their relationship with God, to foreshadow a closer relationship that was to come. But Israel was not faithful to God. They immediately made the golden calf, followed by many other such issues. And when they spied out the land that God had promised to give their fathers, they did not trust him. And so God caused them to wander in the wilderness until that generation had died. He fed them with bread from heaven, with quail, gave them water from rocks. And when that generation had passed and Moses passed leadership down to Joshua, it was time for the invasion and conquest of Canaan. Joshua led the people in a holy war against the Canaanites. And God gave them victory over Jericho and Ai and Hazor and many other Canaanite cities. With every victory and even in times of struggle, this generation was careful to memorialize and to walk after the faithfulness of God. Except after the initial conquest of the land, they did not fully dispossess the pagans from living among them, and the worldly influence they left in the area led to the time of the judges. This was a dark time for God's people. They forgot God and all that he had done for them. They followed after the pagan gods of the nations living among them. Every generation seemed to get worse. As a society, no one followed any authority except for their own, everyone doing what was right in their own eyes. And finally, when they had already become like all of the pagan nations in every other way, they asked for Samuel to give them a king, asking for a man to step into the role of God. And this led to the United Kingdom. Saul was the first king appointed over Israel. God used him to deliver some good victories for his people. But Saul sinned in such a way that God took the kingdom out of his hand and gave it to David. And David became Israel's greatest king as a man after God's own heart. God promised David that through his descendants, an everlasting kingdom would be established. David's son Solomon followed him and built the temple for God. But even though he was a wise man, he sinned because of his love for women. And the kingdom was taken from the hand of his son, except for the tribe of Judah, so that God's promise to David would be preserved. And so this led to the divided kingdom. Solomon's son Rehoboam followed bad advice of his young friends instead of listening to the elders and learning from the history that they presented. This led to Jeroboam leading the northern kingdom away from Rehoboam's rule, and Israel and Judah became two separate nations. Israel especially struggled spiritually because Jeroboam established a national idolatry, and the Israelites that remained faithful to God defected to the southern kingdom. Eventually, this wickedness caught up to them, which led to the period of Judah alone. Because of Israel's wickedness, the northern kingdom was taken away into Assyrian captivity. But Judah began to follow in Israel's steps, and so God sent prophets like Habakkuk, Isaiah, Jeremiah to try to warn them. But eventually Judah's wickedness led them into captivity as well. During this time period, God's people lived like foreigners, like captives in a foreign land, a lot like we should feel today. Prophets like Ezekiel and Daniel helped to keep the faithful remnant alive and faithful under captivity. This period proves that God's people can maintain their identity and their holiness even under the worst of circumstances. And the faithfulness of these righteous few eventually led to the return from captivity. Through God's power over the nations, the circumstances came together for Zerubbabel to return to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple, for Nehemiah to rebuild the wall, for Ezra to restore worship and order to God's people. Esther also takes place during this period, just not in Jerusalem. Many of God's people were scattered throughout the Persian Empire, but even though they are not returned to Judah, through Esther, God preserves and provides for his people. Towards the end of this period comes the prophet Malachi. And even though so much of Israel's identity had been restored in Jerusalem, the people were discontent. They don't feel as if God loves them, and that causes them to drift into ritualism and disrespectful service, which takes us into the years of silence. This is the blank page between Malachi and Matthew in your Bible, but it represents 400 years of Persian, Greek, and Roman rule. During this time, God did not speak through a prophet, but God's silence did not mean God's absence. Just as is the case today, he had spoken through his prophets already, and he had told them what to expect. And Malachi had said that one would come to prepare the way for the coming of the great day of the Lord. And this, of course, is referring to John the Baptist and the life of Christ. All of history had led up to this. The rest of history looks back to it. Jesus fulfilled all of the patterns that God had laid out from the beginning of time. He provided patterns for us to follow today. His death, burial, and resurrection provided the opportunity for salvation, for hope, for restoration, for all peoples to be reconciled to God. And by his example and teachings, he established the early church. Through the teachings of Jesus' apostles, they taught, they baptized people to become his disciples. These disciples became a special people with a special purpose and continued in fellowship with one another because of their fellowship with God. They were organized into local congregations with deacons and elders to carry out the work of God in their communities. And through many tribulations, they persevered as the people of God. But with those trials came discouragement and temptation and sin. And so the leaders of the early church wrote the letters to Christians. Romans to Revelation are all letters written to first century Christians as they struggled with all of the same struggles that we still face today. They endured, they overcame, they looked to Christ as the author and finisher of their faith. And just as our fathers have done, we can also do. This is not just a story. It's our story. It's our story. It's our history as the people of God. It's our legacy to carry on in faith. It's our foundation on which to build and to restore and to fortify. This is the story that God designed and the people that Christ built for you to be a part of. Won't you take your place in God's plan for history as a part of his people today? To find your identity and build your life around what God created for you to do and be. If we can help you become a Christian or to uphold your commitment as a Christian this evening, please find me after services or come